You know, woodworking is all about techniques, but in the case of this clock, it's all about the sequence of techniques, especially for this front frame. Now, the frame consists of 5 pieces. There are 2 vertical pieces, the stiles, and then 3 horizontal pieces, the rails. Now, normally I would cut all those pieces to final size, but in this case, I cut the stiles to final length, but only to rough width. The other feature here is that the rails are thinner than the stiles, and that creates this offset on the front of the clock, which is a nice little design feature. So I had to plane down the stock for the rails, and while I was at it, I made a few extra pieces for test pieces for the joinery later. Well, the joinery for this clock is mortise and tenon joinery, and that means cutting a mortise in the stiles and joining it with tenons on the ends of the rails. Now, I start with the mortises, and in this case, the mortises are offset to the back face of the stiles, so that when I install the rails, they're flush on the back and offset on the front. Well, to cut these mortises, I actually go over to the drill press first. Cut a series of overlapping holes to rough out the mortises. Now, after the mortises are roughed out, I just use a chisel and square up the sides and the ends of the mortises. Once that's done, I can head over to the table saw and complete the frame. Well, the Craftsman-style look of this clock gets a lot of its character from these tapered sides. And in order to make the tapered sides, I had to make a jig, this simple plywood jig here. I just laid out the angle of the taper that I wanted and then rough cut it over at the bandsaw. Now, in order to hold the stile in place, I've also added some double-sided tape. I'll tear these pieces off. And then I can mount the stile inside the jig with the bottom of the stile at the front of the jig, press it in place, push the jig against the fence, and then make the tapered cut. Well, now I've got the taper cut on the 2 stiles, and there's this little waste piece. I'm actually going to save that because I need to use it during assembly, but we'll get to that in just a minute. The next step is to cut the tenons on the ends of the 3 rails. And to do that, I've mounted a dado set in the saw, buried it in a wooden auxiliary fence, and set the height for the height I need for the thickness of the tenon. Now I'm going to go ahead and cut this on a test piece first. Just push the piece up against the fence, make 1 pass, flip the piece over, make another pass, then turn it on edge and make 2 more passes. Now with the tenon cut on the end of the test piece, I can test the fit in the mortise. And okay, it fits pretty good. It's flush on the back, and we have an offset on the front. Now, as long as the test piece works, I can go ahead and cut tenons on all 3 rails. Okay, with the tenons cut on the ends of all 3 rails, I'm ready to glue up the frame. But there's one last little detail, and that is to round over the inside edges of both of the stiles. And while I was at it, I rounded over the inside edges on the 3 rails, leaving the top and the bottom edges square. So now I can test the fit, and I'll dry assemble everything. Bring the other stile up and fit it in. Okay, and it looks pretty good, so I could start clamping it up, but I've got these tapered sides, so that's why I saved these extra little pieces. And I put some double-sided tape on here so I can bring those up and just temporarily tape them to the sides, and that gives me now square edges, so I can bring up my clamps and test my fit there. So we look good at the top and look good at the bottom. So my joints all fit tight. All I have to do is unassemble this and go ahead and glue it together, and I've got my frame complete. You know, Brian, the front frame's all done here, but there's a lot of woodworking here. 6 mortise and tenon joints, then tapered sides with a custom jig on the table saw.
You know, it's a great start on the front frame. Of course, we still add some more parts, and that includes the sides as well as the top. Now, of course, that features some great craftsman details, like the arc on the bottom of the sides. And then on the underside of the top, there's a small bevel.
Well, and the detail that I like the best are these false tenons here on the top that filled in nice craftsman detail.
Of course, there's a lot of woodworking here, so I'm going to head to the shop and get started. Although the front frame of the clock was assembled, there was still one more task to complete, and that was to cut this rabbet along the outside edges of the stiles. And that's for the sides of the clock that are going to be added. Now, I made that cut at the table saw. With the dado blade installed and buried in an auxiliary fence, I completed each rabbet by making a single pass along the outside edge. The rabbets complete the front frame, so next up are the sides of the clock. Now, I started by cutting my pieces to final width. And when it comes to cutting the final length, you need to pay attention to one thing, and that's the angle of the taper at the top and bottom. By slightly tilting my saw blade to match the angle of the taper, I cut one end of each side. Then I flip the work pieces over and cut them both to final length. Now, with the sides cut to final length, there's a couple more details to take care of. And the first is to cut a rabbet along the back edge of each side, and that's to accept the back that's going to be added later. Now, to do that, I use the same technique as cutting the rabbet for the front frame. I buried a dado blade in an auxiliary fence and cut the rabbet in one pass. Now, the final detail to take care of is on the bottom of each side, and it's a classic craftsman detail. It's this small arc, and I cut that at the bandsaw. Staying just outside the layout line, make the cut in a single pass. Well, after sanding the arc smooth, I'm ready to attach the sides to the front frame. Now, the only thing to keep in mind there, when you apply the clamps, is to make sure keep everything flush at the top and bottom. Well, after gluing the sides to the front frame, I took one last step and rounded over the front edge here. And what that does is virtually makes this joint line invisible. And I did that at the router table. With a roundover bit installed, I made a single pass along each edge. Now, the last main part of the clock body to add is the top. Now, the top is just cut to size, but then to add another classic craftsman detail, I beveled 3 of the edges. And I did that at the table saw. After tilting the blade and installing a tall auxiliary fence for solid support, I made a pass along each end, and then a single pass along the front edge. Well, with the bevels complete, this top is ready to install. Now, it could just be glued in place. Unfortunately, there's a lot of end grain on the stiles, and the sides here, not a great glue joint. So instead, to attach it securely, I'm going to screw it in place. Of course, I don't want the screw heads to show, so I'm going to do something a little different and add a little detail at the same time. I'm going to bury the screws in shallow mortises. Now, I created those mortises by drilling a counterbore and then just squaring up the edges. Now, to hide the screw, I'll add a small wood plug, tap it down into the mortise, and then I'll chisel it flush and sand it smooth. Well, I just need to get the top screwed down and get the plugs installed, and the body of this clock will be complete.
Well, Brian, it's starting to look like a clock.
Got everything sanded smooth and flush.
And we just need a few more things. One of those is going to be a back for this whole clock, but we're going to get to that a little bit later. The key thing is a backer board that goes right behind the front frame.
And that backer board serves some important purposes. And the first is, that's where we're going to mount the tile here at the bottom. Of course, we need a way to mount the clock movement and the clock face up here at the top.
Well, you could just cut a board and put it in there and make that'd be good enough for the clock face, but we decided to do a little woodworking. So we're going to I cut these 4 blocks, and we're going to put those together to actually create this clock face.
Right, but the clock movement needs some markers, so we're going to cut some notches here and install these white oak plugs, and they'll match the rest of the clock, and they fit in just like this.
So now we've created a little problem. We need to cut those notches, and they have to line up. So the trick for doing that is to stack all 4 pieces and then clamp them together as one block.
And then you can head to the router table. Using a 1/4-inch straight bit, I made a single pass to cut the notches in all 4 blocks at once.
Okay, well now we've got our notches cut in all 4 pieces, and we have to glue this little marker in place. Well, the trick here is to use a fast setting glue, molding and trim glue. It'll set up a little bit faster. Just put a dab of glue in each notch, and then we add our marker in between. Oops. And there we go. And then you just hold it together for just a minute or 2 until that glue sets up.
Now while you do that, it is kind of important to maintain this nice even shadow line because it gives the clock face a unique look. And I've got a common sense solution to that, Don. There we go.
Okay,
we
good.
Just drop it in.
All right, so we've got our penny solution here, and we just let that, the glue set up on that one, and then we go to the bottom 2 pieces, and we'll add the marker in between.
There.
Thanks for your 2 cents on it.
You're welcome. Here for you.
Okay. And when those 2 are done, then we'll go ahead and add the markers down here at the bottom, or to add the bottom and the top together. Okay, things are going to fly around here a little bit, but then we can get all these pieces, all 4 pieces, all joined together with the markers in place.
Yep, and probably a good idea to add just a couple in there and make sure everything stays nice and consistent.
Right, it's a good, sensible solution. Okay, so you go ahead and let that, all the glue dry on that, and then we'll have our clock face.
Now once the glue sets up, the clock face is just about complete, but we will need to add a movement later, and it has a fairly large post, so we'll need to drill a larger hole in the center of the face.
And to hold all this together, we made a little backer board, and we're going to use our old standard favorite, double-sided tape. So I've put that on the board, and then I'll pull this up, and all the pennies will drop off, and I'll put the face right on this backer board held down with the double-sided tape in order to drill the hole.
That's pretty easy at the drill press. You just really need to center it and drill a larger hole.
Well, we're just about done. There's just a few more steps, and one of them is to apply finish and stain to our clock first. So we're going to use a gel stain. It's a lot easier to apply with a cloth and get in all these little nooks and crannies. And then we'll also use a gel polyurethane. Again, it's applied with a cloth.
Now once all that's done, you're ready to add the last couple items. But first, you need to drill a hole for the clock movement. And I used the clock face to locate that. Movement just slips into place, and then the clock face, a little glue, you can press that into place.
Okay, and let me give you a hand here. So,
we do need those.
Yeah, we do. So we need the clock hands on the face, and then the very last step is we're going to add our tile, and we'll do that with a silicone adhesive, a little bit in the opening, and then we'll drop our tile in place and press it down and let it dry.
And once the tile's in place, what you end up with is a great Craftsman-style clock.
Woodsmithplans.com. Hundreds of professional, high-quality woodworking plans right at your fingertips. Every single plan is presented as an easy-to-download digital package that includes pages of step-by-step instructions, full-color photos, illustrations, and exploded views, retail sources for hardware and supplies, plus a cutting diagram and materials list. Many plans offer handy video overviews and guides. Plus, we're proud to offer our plans in both standard and metric. Everything is here, from gorgeous heirloom furniture projects to handy shop projects and upgrades, clever, cost-effective storage solutions, as well as weekend projects and accessories that are great for gifts, all fully searchable and categorized for easy browsing. Woodsmithplans.com, everything you need for building fine woodworking projects.